Right now, somewhere on the other side of an ocean, there's a continent so vast it holds mountains taller than clouds, rivers wider than some countries, and forests that stretch further than the eye could ever follow. For most of human history, half the world had absolutely no idea it existed. Two enormous landmasses, teeming with life, with cities, with millions of people living entire civilizations, completely hidden from the other half of the planet. And then one day, a few small wooden ships stumbled into it by accident. That single moment cracked the world open and rewrote the future of every human alive. But what if it hadn't? What if those ships never came? What if America was never discovered at all? Tonight, let's find out just how different your entire world would be. First, let's clear something up, because the word discovered is doing a lot of lying here. America wasn't empty, waiting to be found. When those first ships arrived, there were already tens of millions of people living there. Enormous cities, some larger than any city in Europe at the time. Vast trade networks, roads, pyramids, astronomy, farming systems so advanced they'd feed the entire world for centuries to come. So when we ask, what if America was never discovered? What we're really asking is, what if these two halves of humanity had stayed strangers for even longer? What if the ocean between them had kept it secret? To understand how much hangs on this, you have to understand how truly separated these worlds were. For thousands and thousands of years, the people on each side of that ocean evolved completely apart. Different crops, different animals, different diseases, different everything. It's almost like there were two separate experiments in what it means to be human, running side by side, neither knowing the other existed. And the moment they finally touched, the shockwave was so enormous that it reshaped bodies, borders, languages, and the entire path of our species. Remove that moment, and the ripples that reach all the way to you today simply never happen. Let's start with the most invisible change of all, the one hiding in your kitchen. Picture the foods you eat. Now imagine a world where half of them vanish, because so many of the foods we think of as ancient and traditional actually came from the Americas, and only spread across the world after that contact. Without it, there are no tomatoes in Italy. Let that sink in. No tomatoes means no pizza as we know it, no pasta sauce, none of it. There are no potatoes in Ireland or across Europe, a crop so important it would later feed entire nations. There's no chocolate flowing out to the rest of the world, no corn feeding livestock across continents, no chili peppers lighting up the food of India and Asia. Entire national cuisines that feel timeless would simply never exist. The map of what humanity eats would be unrecognizable. But food is just the gentle beginning, because the next change is far darker, and it's the real reason the collision was so catastrophic: disease. When the two worlds met, the deadliest thing that crossed the ocean wasn't a weapon. It was invisible. For thousands of years, the people of Europe, Asia, and Africa had lived crammed together with domesticated animals, cows, pigs, chickens, sharing their spaces, and, over generations, sharing their germs. Their bodies became walking fortresses, hardened against a whole army of diseases. The people of the Americas had almost none of those animals, and so almost none of those diseases. Their immune systems had never met these invaders. And when contact came, the result was one of the greatest catastrophes in human history. Wave after wave of sickness swept across the Americas, and in the span of a century, a huge portion of the population was gone. Not from swords, from germs they never saw coming. So in a world where America is never discovered, tens of millions of people don't die from these diseases. Entire nations, entire cultures, entire languages that were erased in our timeline would continue, would still be here today. Now think about what that means for the shape of the modern world. In our history, the arrival of outsiders led to the fall of mighty empires, the drawing of new borders, and the birth of entirely new nations built on top of the old ones. Without that contact, none of it unfolds. The great civilizations of the Americas continue developing on their own terms, in their own directions, for centuries more. The countries you know today, with the languages they speak and the flags they fly, most of them simply never come to exist. The entire political map of half the planet gets erased and redrawn into something we can barely imagine. And here's where it reaches across the ocean and changes the other side of the world too. Because that first contact didn't just transform the Americas, it transformed everyone. Think about the sheer flood of wealth that poured out of those two continents: the silver, the gold, the new crops, the new land. That wealth supercharged the nations that got there first, launching them from ordinary kingdoms into globe-spanning empires. It funded armies, navies, and centuries of expansion. Remove that flood of wealth, and the balance of power across the entire world tilts in a completely different direction. The countries that became superpowers might have stayed small. The countries that stayed small might have risen instead. The whole pecking order of nations, the one that still shapes global power today, could be turned completely upside down. But let's go even deeper, past the money and the empires, into something more fundamental: people. Because the meeting of these two worlds didn't just move goods and germs, it moved human beings, on a massive scale, often by force, in one of the darkest chapters our species has ever written. Millions of lives were uprooted and carried across oceans against their will. Entire populations were blended, displaced, and transformed. And out of that immense upheaval came new peoples, new cultures, new blends of humanity that had never existed before. Now, imagine none of that movement happens. The map of who lives where, of which peoples mix and which stay separate, is utterly different, which means the specific combination of ancestors that led to a huge number of people alive today, possibly including you, never comes together. Different people are born, different families form. The human race itself, in terms of who actually exists, would be populated by different individuals entirely. So let's stand back and look at the world we've built here, this alternate Earth where the ships never sailed. Two great halves of humanity, still developing in isolation. The civilizations of the Americas, never conquered, growing into who knows what across centuries of their own history. Food staying local, cuisines around the world unrecognizable. Empires that never gorge themselves on new world wealth, staying humble while different powers rise instead. And billions of people across the whole planet who in our timeline never would have been born, living entire lives in a world that looks nothing like ours. It's not a small change. It's a completely different planet. But now comes the part that makes this more than just a fun thought experiment, because here's the uncomfortable question. Was it ever really avoidable? Some would argue that contact was inevitable, that once humans had ships capable of crossing oceans, it was only a matter of time before someone from some direction stumbled onto those continents. Maybe not those specific ships, not that specific year, but eventually. The two worlds were always going to find each other. In this view, we're not asking if it would happen, only when and how gently or how brutally. And that changes the question entirely. Because maybe the real what if isn't whether the worlds met, but whether they could have met differently. Not through catastrophe and conquest, but through something slower, something more equal. A meeting of two civilizations as genuine strangers with something to learn from each other, instead of one crashing down upon the other. Imagine how different everything might be if that first contact had been a handshake instead of a collision. And that's the thought I want to leave you with. We tend to think of the world map as fixed, permanent, the way things simply are. Countries in their places, foods in their kitchens, peoples in their homelands, as if it were all always meant to be this way. But it wasn't. So much of the world you take for granted, the meal on your plate, the language in your mouth, the borders on your map, maybe even your own existence, traces back to a handful of wooden ships that stumbled across an ocean and found a world that was never lost, only waiting. Change that one voyage and everything downstream changes with it, which means the world you live in isn't the only world that could have been. It's just the one that happened. And when you really understand that, you start to see how fragile, how accidental, and how astonishingly unlikely your entire reality actually is.